All right, we are live with episode 2 of the Fantasy Formula. I'm Adam Medeiros from F1FantasyHQ.com, and I'm joined here by Ali from FanAmp. Ali, thanks so much for joining me on episode 2.
Yeah, of course. Crazy. We already got a sub week two. For any of those of you who watched last week, obviously we had Will, on the show, caught the stomach bug. So I'm subbing in. Yeah, excited. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I've been with FanAmp for a while, and I do a lot of this stuff on social media. So yeah, excited to kind of like get into this. Know a little
Awesome.
bit
And
about fantasy, but not too much. So
good. Well, we got a lot to teach you this week, and we all wish Will a speedy recovery. Let's
mm.
get right into our updates from Canada. We have a lot to break down from the race 2 weeks ago.
All
We're going to
right,
talk about a really rough day for Nico Hulkenberg as he lost more positions. We're going to talk about that driver number 2 battle between Checo Perez and George Russell. We're going to talk about Alex Albon in the Williams. I'm sporting the Williams to support Alex after a great P7 result. And we're going to talk about not only how dominant Red Bull has been, but what does it mean as we look ahead to Austria? And then lastly, we'll talk about the long overdue price increases that came out of the F1 fantasy game after Canada. And then
awesome.
before we get into Austria, we'll look at how mine and Will's team did in Canada. See if those predictions worked out for us 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. I know it was a great race weekend, in my opinion. For us, 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago. Yeah, especially I'm excited to talk about the album. I thought that was like awesome. So yeah, excited to get into it.
All right, let's start right at the top with a tough day for Nico Hulkenberg. So Haas pitted him a little bit early to get a long stint on the hards. Unfortunately, it was right before a safety car was deployed, so that whole midfield got a cheaper pit stop. That tumbled Nico down to the bottom third of the grid order. And then from there, it was really tough sledding for him for the rest of the Grand Prix.
Yeah,
And you can see in this chart on the right, these are positions gained and lost by all of our budget drivers each week. Hulkenberg is dead last among all drivers. He's net lost 21 positions over the course of the year, including -8 2 races ago and -10 this past race. So very, very tough fantasy performances for Nico owners.
yeah. Bad year for Haas overall. Bad year for Nico. Yeah, it seems like they're having a pit stop way more frequently than all the other teams, and like they're just not able to maintain their initial lap speed. So I'm not 100% sure on the fantasy implications, but like I'd expect to see a lot of solid qualifyings, but getting worse during the race and
I
losing a lot of
agree.
positions.
And you really hit the nail on the head there, Ali. This is what I think Hulkenberg is from a fantasy perspective for the rest of the year. Someone that will qualify high and then lose places throughout the course of the Grand Prix. And then at the end of the day, his fantasy score suffers as a result. So I would tend to avoid him as much as possible. I'm very interested in seeing how Logan Sargent handles the upgrades in the Williams. You saw Alex Albon exceeding, getting that P7 result in Canada. Sargent didn't run those upgrades, and he has a similar price to Hulkenberg. If you see Sargent going faster this week, I think that's the sign that if you have very low budget, I would even start Logan Sargent over Hulkenberg.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, the upgrades worked well for Albon. We'll get more of that later, and excited to see how Sargent performs in it. Been a lot of talk that possibly Mick Schumacher is going to be taking a seat next year, so I'll be excited to see him in those new upgrades.
Awesome. Let's move on to our second topic, which is the battle for driver number 2. We were talking about the recent surge from George Russell. He had outscored Perez from a fantasy perspective in 3 straight races, and he was a very popular addition to teams heading into Canada. But unfortunately for those owners, things didn't quite go as expected. So Russell ended up DNFing the race after a mental mistake put him into the wall, and that ultimately led to an early retirement later in the race. Russell, with that penalty, finished with negative 12 fantasy points, and it really killed some of that momentum for him. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have Perez, who had another poor qualifying performance, but that allowed him to make up 6 positions in the race. He got the fastest lap at the end of the race. And so his 28 points in Canada were second to only Verstappen. So while Perez may be in some hot water in the Red Bull garage, he's looking really good for fantasy owners. Another strong result for Checo.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, like, I guess as a fan, you kind of look, you watch Checo miss the podium again. Doesn't look like a great performance from a fan side, but I think if I think he's going to get a lot of overtakes if he continues to struggle in these qualifyings. So yeah, and then obviously George Russell, just a bad move, driver mistake. I think that they were saying that there were some issues with the car, but yeah, I think he definitely has the higher a higher DNF probability than a lot of the other drivers in top cars.
Absolutely, especially when you compare the DNF rate between Russell and Hamilton. The Mercedes very rarely fails to finish a race, but the only 2 DNFs the last 2 seasons belong to George. One other point I want to make on the slide here is the value changes. We're going to look, it's a little sneak peek at a slide we have coming up. Perez went up 0.3 million, whereas Russell went down 0.5 million. He was the only driver on the grid to lose value, and he lost a big amount. It makes him a good value buy moving forward, but also as we try to understand these value changes, also a little bit risky too.
Yeah, makes sense. Absolutely.
Let's move on to the stunner of the week, which was Alex Albon, P7 in a Williams. Ali, what did you think about his performance?
Oh, I thought that was awesome. That was my favorite part of the race, watching him hold off and masterfully defend 4 cars. I thought it was awesome, especially in a Williams. No offense to anyone over at Williams, but definitely had a lot more higher performance cars behind him, and was able to hold them off. And just every time we thought this is a turn where they all smoke by him, he just kept making the perfect move. Huge fan of Alex Albon. Hope he gets another shot with a top team. Obviously his Red Bull stint didn't go great, but yeah, excited to kind of see him for the rest of the season.
Yeah, Albon had 59 laps on that hard tire, and it's been a consistent theme this season is if you can catch the right driver at the right track and they get a long stint on the hard tires and can hold off that DRS train, some of these midfield and bottom of the field drivers can put up a surprise. I want to
Yeah.
talk about the fantasy output from Albon because that was pretty incredible too. Thanks to his driver of the day win, he finished with 22 fantasy points in Canada, which is the most among all drivers in a single race this season. When you talk about those budget drivers that are $5 million or less, that was the best performance among that group of drivers. So really terrific result for Albon.
Are you throwing him in your starting lineup now? Or I guess we'll find that out later.
I'll give you a sneak peek at that. Right now, he's still a little too expensive for me. You'll see on the screen that he went up 1 million after last week. So if you didn't have him in your lineups, it's going to be hard to maneuver your lineup to get him in. And also, I would remind everybody that he struggled with DNFs earlier in the season. He's still one of the bottom drivers when you look at total points on the season. But I'm very encouraged by those upgrades and what they did for him last week.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Do we want to check out the price increases or lineup review? Okay. Yeah. So obviously, I'm kind of subbing in. I will be picking for Will's team today. But seems like we both had pretty good weeks. Right?
We did, yeah. And so our predictions in Canada worked really well. I think the obvious guys, Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, all worked really well. They got their normal allocation of points. Yuki Tsunoda was a positive budget driver. You didn't have the negative day that Hulkenberg and Sargent had. So all you need is finishing the race without losing too many positions. That's what Yuki did. Lance Stroll on the race wasn't terribly impressive, but he gained just enough positions, got himself into some points. Not a bad result from him. So I'm pretty happy with how my team looked. And then over on Will's side, the only difference was that he had started Zhou Guanyu. I'm surprised to see that the guy that leads all drivers in overtakes had none this week. And I think that contributed a lot to his points. But I suspect a comeback in the overtakes category for Zhou when we look ahead to Austria.
Yeah, awesome. And you saw Lance. I heard that there was some fantasy controversy over with that last overtake from Bottas.
That's right. So when they assigned the points on Sunday night for Canada, Lance had 0 overtakes. And we all saw that overtake on Bottas on the last straight. It was clear that he had at least one. And our friends over at F1FantasyTools.com, they gathered up their Discord community. They were pounding the F1 help chat with requests to review Stroll's overtake numbers. And not only did they update Stroll's score, they gave him 5 overtakes. So Stroll ended up with more points than what he was originally credited as. So big thanks to all of you that had sent those requests to the F1 help chat to get that score updated.
Awesome. And yeah, we're going to get to Austria. One more thing we have to cover. I know you were excited to cover this. Price increases. We're finally getting them, or significant price increases.
Yes. So at this point, up until Canada, no driver had moved more than 0.2 million. And that was reserved only for Ocon and his surprise podium and those movements on Fernando Alonso since he was so underpriced. Now we have our first big movements of the season. The big winners in this were Alonso, Aston Martin, and Albon. They all went up 1 million. We heard earlier, George Russell was the only loser, going down 500,000. And it looks like the early sense is that these price changes are biased based on the most recent race. So Russell with the DNF in Canada, despite the otherwise positive season for him, that's what weighted heavily into the loss of value. So with each week, we'll learn a little bit more about what triggers these price changes and then try to make the most out of it so we can gain our cost cap over the rest of the season.
Yeah, these price changes, really, to be honest, confuse me. It's crazy to me how, Fernando Alonso, P3 for the season, in, the standings, is 10.4 million, but I believe George Russell was 18.2. Yeah, pretty crazy. Glad that they're finally getting some changes, but yeah, seems a little confusing.
It's a long time coming. I can only assume that they wanted a big enough sample size to start setting their prices as accurately as possible so they didn't overreact to the early races, but it really made things boring for setting our lineups. But what this unlocks for us now are 2 big considerations each week. The first is, how do I score the most points? The second is, how do I grow my cost cap the most so that later in the season I can afford higher levels of drivers and constructors and get even more points? How do we strike that balance to score the most points over the balance of the season?
Yeah. All right. Do you want to get into Austria?
Sure. Let's jump right into Austria. And we have a bunch of headlines to talk about as we prepare for this weekend.
Verstappen continues to amaze. Obviously been amazing this season. Red Bull rivals eyeing some upgrades. I've seen some reports on McLaren and Aston Martin. And using the 3x DRS boost, I'll be excited to talk to you about that. And obviously the weather report at the end.
Yes,
let's get into
it. That's a constantly evolving situation with the weather. I know the latest as of 30 minutes ago, so I'm excited to put on my weatherman hat for you. Now, on our first topic here, I want to talk about Verstappen. So he has the opportunity to really achieve a lot this weekend. He has this laps led record that he's approaching. With this week, he can pass the number 2 and number 3 longest streaks all time, which are both owned by Senna. And we've heard from Max that there are some records he doesn't care about, but some records he really puts some stock in. And I think back to a quote from Helmut Marko a few weeks ago when they were talking about Max potentially driving in the Nürburgring. He said he had talked to Max about trying to push that car to set the single lap record on that track. And that's part of why he's not allowing him to run in Nürburgring. Here, this is another one of those records that I think is really important to Max. There are some other really important things to consider this weekend too. Because they're at the Red Bull Ring, you're going to see a lot of orange in the stands. This is going to be a mini home race for Max and the Red Bull team. And also, the betting lines so heavily expect Max to run away with it. So for anyone who isn't familiar with what a betting line looks like, minus 275 tells us that for every 275 that you bet on Verstappen to win, you'll only win $100. And so if that number was positive for every $100 you bet, that's the number, the multiplier of your winnings on the other end. So this is one of Max's most favored betting lines of the whole season.
Yeah, makes sense. It's obviously a Red Bull Ring, home track, a track he's done very well in the past. I believe like 2 years ago he had a DNF from an engine failure, but other than that, I think he's been very solid at that track, if I'm remembering correctly.
He has been, yeah. So
Yeah.
he's won 4 times in 6 races. The only 2 exceptions were, like you said, that DNF due to the engine issue, and then the P2 finish when Leclerc won last year. But also, he's qualified on pole 3 straight races in Austria. So there's a clear dominance amongst Verstappen compared to the other drivers at the Red Bull Ring.
Yeah, if he secures pole and has a good turn one, I would not be surprised at all if it's kind of the same story and he leads every lap of the race. So yeah,
It'll be really exciting to see. And this is going to be one of our FanAmp questions of the week. I'm excited to see what all of you put. How many laps will Max lead this week?
Yeah. All right. Do we want to move over to the next slide?
Yeah, let's talk about some of the rivals for Red Bull as they prepare their upgrades. So we saw Aston Martin roll out some upgrades over the last few weeks. Alonso stuck at P2 in Canada, so they're clearly starting to extract a lot of pace from those upgrades. And I think Aston Martin will extract even more pace as they learn more about the latest iteration of their car. But I'm most excited about the Mercedes upgrades. You can see this quote here that talks about not only do they plan to roll out a big package at Silverstone next weekend, but they also plan to have one more upgrade package before the summer break. And so this tells me that teams are really trying to make a run at Red Bull before the break. And we're potentially running out of time that Max is the clear-cut number 1 driver in the game.
Yeah. It'll be really interesting to see. Obviously as a fan, I'd love to see that gap close. Especially for me, these two, Alonso, Hamilton, and then Max, I would love to see some great battles between them. And yeah, last race, Alonso and Hamilton had an awesome battle. And it would be really cool to see them close the gap. And I think everyone, or unless you're a super hardcore Red Bull fan, would be a bit disappointed if they sweep the schedule. So yeah, hopefully these upgrades, have some significance and, give us a little more show at the top.
And since really the start of the season, the biggest headline has been the Red Bull cost cap infringement and what that means to their wind tunnel hours. They recently released the revised wind tunnel hour allocation for the rest of the year. Red Bull obviously have the fewest hours at 756, and that's 144 hours lower than what they were at this point last season. Meanwhile, Mercedes has 900 hours in the wind tunnel and Aston Martin 960. So can they use the rest of their wind tunnel allocation, the rest of their 2023 cost cap allocation? Can they make a run at Red Bull for the rest of the year? I'm hopeful that they do.
Yeah, same here.
So let's talk about really my biggest strategy for this week is, barring anything crazy in FP1 tomorrow morning, I'm going to use the 3x chip on Max Verstappen. And this is really one of the biggest fantasy decisions you'll make all year, because there are 3 events in a sprint weekend, you could get upwards of 180 points from a single driver. But on the other hand, if Max DNFs, that negative 20-point penalty is tripled, and it would really ruin my season. And so there are a few reasons why I'm so excited to do it this week. The first is that heavy betting line that Vegas predicts Max to win by. Vegas is very rarely wrong, and they're so confident in him this week. Second is, we talked earlier about his dominance at this track, how he's on the precipice of a very important record, how he's on a home track, and also that he has some competition nipping at his heels. And maybe this is the last sprint of the year where Max is a clear-cut top driver.
Yeah. It'll be interesting because, as we mentioned before, like those upgrades, if they do shake things up, this is going to be my first week playing fantasy, but it would make sense to use a boost on Max now, especially at his, home Red Bull ring.
And I want to talk about one of the biggest debates that I've had with folks over FanAmp and over Twitter this week. Why use the 3x DRS boost versus Limitless? And Limitless is a chip that allows you to throw out the cost cap and get the most expensive drivers on the grid. And you can also make unlimited transfers in and out of your lineup throughout the week. I think Limitless is a very powerful chip this week because certainly you can get the best drivers on the grid and extract 3 events worth of value from them. I think this is a little bit safer because, one, if it rains, I'm only really accounting for 1 driver that's impacted by the chip, and Max is very good in the rain. Whereas with Limitless, you have a lot of drivers you've brought in under the chip and a lot more loose ends as the rain affects them. The other reason is that I think Limitless will be more valuable after these upgrades from some of the other teams when there's a clear-cut top 4 or 5. I think right now, both Red Bulls, both Ferraris, Alonso, and both Mercedes are in that discussion, and you could pick wrong as you try to figure out your Limitless team.
Yeah, especially, makes sense because, not all the top drivers are as good as Max in the rain. He's kind of always been the guy where, like, when it's a super wet field, he usually, gets a huge gap. And that makes sense on my end.
Yeah, and I think Max, not only does he do so well in the rain, he also wins by so much where he can have a moment or two on track and still not lose P1. The Red Bull Ring being a purpose-built track, there's a lot of forgiveness on either side of the racing line. It's not like Monaco where one slip you could be into the wall and your day's over. It would take a pretty big incident for Max to DNF as a result of the rain. So that's another reason why I'm confident despite the weather.
Yeah.
And speaking of the weather, let's get right into that forecast for this weekend. So, Ali, how much rain do you think we're going to see between the qualifying, the sprint events, and the race this week?
I'm honestly hoping for the rain. I think, I always love to see the madness. I love to see some like mid-race rain, where it, surprise that maybe it'll just be, George is a really sweaty day. But I'm hoping that we kind of just, I know it's not good for you and your fantasy team, but I'm just hoping like we see some wild stuff, Red Bulls DNF, and see, like a crazy result, which I feel like we've kind of been, missing this season.
Yeah, I think we could have some very interesting results this weekend. as we look at the forecast versus the timing of when the events are, Friday, the qualifying event is obviously most important because that sets the grid order for Sunday. I think there will be pockets of dry where I think it'll be a fairly normal result. Whereas Saturday, the latest forecasts have the most rain basically throughout the day. So I think both the sprint shootout and the sprint will be heavily impacted by the rain. And from a fantasy perspective, this means that you could have a driver that's knocked out early in the sprint shootout, but they can gain a lot of positions in the sprint race. And that's a great opportunity. So you're almost hoping that your top drivers are impacted by that rain in the sprint shootout, because that's a bigger point opportunity for the sprint itself. And then on Sunday, the most recent forecasts show it to be the driest of the days. So there might be some spot showers or even rain that impacts part of the track, but I don't think you'll see those full wets in effect on Sunday.
Interesting. Yeah.
So more reason
would
for me to
def-
be confident about that DRS boost.
yeah. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Do you want to get to the FanAmp questions of the week?
Let's do it.
All right. So I believe qualifying should be live right now. You can go on the app, make your picks right now, have the chance to win some awesome prizes. Team merch, get sent to a race, F1 TV subscriptions. It's awesome, and hope you guys check it out and make your picks this week. So qualifying, which McLaren driver are you going with?
So which McLaren driver qualifies worse, Lando or Piastri? So one of the things we didn't talk about is how good Lando has been at this track. Lando has never finished lower than P7, and he's had 2 podium finishes in Austria. So this is actually a track he does really well in. And we've also seen in the wet races this year, Lando has done better than most. And so I'm going to stick with traditional thinking and say that Piastri will qualify lower.
Yeah, I'm going with you on this one. I think this is kind of an easy call. Lando, has been awesome. Obviously, got his first podium on this track. I believe that was like the first race back from COVID, and that was like awesome to watch. And then got another, and yeah, I think that I hope he has a good showing this week. Big fan of his. For the sprint, which team gains the most positions? Which would be and the tie goes to best finish. I guess kind of right here we're looking at who messes up in qualifying. So what are you kind of thinking on that side?
So thinking back to our weather slide, I read this question as who is going to have the most issues in the rain on Friday, and then on the sprint shootout on Saturday morning, and then gain the most positions during the sprint in the afternoon. I'm thinking based on their tough stretch this season that Ferrari will gain the most positions. At least one of them will have an incident in the sprint shootout. What about you?
I think for some reason I'm going with Aston Martin. I could see, I'm really, excited to see that car, and I could see Stroll, making an error in that shootout, and then jumping a few positions. And yeah, I think Alonso, if he, doesn't have a great shootout, will gain a lot of positions. But if he even does really well, I don't think he's losing positions. So, yeah,
One of the things I'm very interested to see is the sprint shootout requires you to have a specific compound of tire for each of the 3 heats in the shootout, but those rules go out the window under certain wet conditions. I'll be very interested to see what that means for tire strategies. Are there drivers that make it into Q3 of the shootout and can't participate in it? That'll be a very interesting angle of this, because Lando, as you remember from Azerbaijan, made it into SQ3 and couldn't participate. So he started the sprint P10.
Interesting. We something to watch. And then last question. As we mentioned before, Max is on an insane streak of leading laps. And the options are, will he lead 60 or more laps, 50 to 60, or less than 50? Or 30 to, I'm sorry, 30 to 59, and then less than 30. What are you kind of thinking on this?
So I'm putting my 3x chip on Max this week, expecting him to lead every lap. So I'm going with 60 or more. I think really the only reasonable options this week are he leads all the laps or he's out qualified and doesn't finish the first lap in the lead and it's 0 laps led. So I think it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
What about you, Allie?
I maybe I'm speaking as a fan here. I hope just it's
You're
even
hoping for
season.
0.
It seems dumb when I'm saying it now, and I'm gonna feel like an idiot. Like probably on Monday, being like, "Oh yeah, like Max not gonna lead in Red Bull Ring," but I'm hoping we can see some madness. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go 30 to 59, and then he gets
Ooh, you think some
overtaken
mid-race fiasco will lead to a Max
late
overtake?
race. Yeah, mid to late race fiasco.
I like it.
Gets a little Mercedes tire bump. Fernando Alonso sneaks through, gets his number 33. That's how it's gone down. Heard it here first.
So those are your FanAmp picks of the week. Before we go, let's get into a lineup build for this week.
All
So this is
right.
Will's team from last week. You can see it's called Unhappy Ferrari Fan. I'm sorry, Will. They'll get better eventually. Here's the team that he ran, and we're going to walk Allie through if he's going to make any changes, if he's going to apply any chips. Allie, how are you feeling about this team?
It looks good to me. Obviously, Yuki didn't have his best week last week, same as Zoe. But looks like a solid team overall. I'm assuming that these Red Bull guys are kind of shoo-ins. Fernando Alonso seems really cheap. And so what are we doing with the constructors? First of all, keeping those.
I recommend it. We saw just some of the dominance of Red Bull. Red Bull has outscored the number 2 and 3 constructors combined. You can see on the screen there they have 721 points compared to Mercedes plus Ferrari under 700. So they're so dominant you can't take them out of your lineup. Aston Martin, their points per million in salary is still quite high, and I think they're going to gain some value for you again after a sprint weekend. So I would keep the 2 of them there.
Yeah, I mean, from the prices, it seems like this is an easy choice. Yeah, I'm very surprised that the Mercedes gap is that small. But yeah, and also the Ferrari. But yeah,
A lot of these prices are based on their 2022 performance, and so they're still due to level set a bit. So they're, in my opinion, a little more expensive than they probably ought to be.
So then let's go drivers. I think the 3 I would keep would be Checo, Alonso, Max. What do you think we do here? I kind of want to throw Albon in there, but wait, or I guess he's more expensive. He got $1 million jump.
This will be a very tricky decision for you because I have a lot of confidence in a rebound for Zhou Guanyu this week. You'll notice on the screen here, Yuki Tsunoda gained 0.5 million last week rather. But you'll notice also that Zhou has scored more points on the season than Yuki. So I think there's going to be some positive regression for his price after this week. And I think Yuki may come back to earth unless he has a really good sprint weekend. So if I was to sub any driver out, I would pull Yuki.
Looking like there's not a lot of great options outside of Yuki for that spot.
Yeah, that's a
I would not go Hulkenberg.
So in Will's case, he started playing last week. So he started with the very minimum salary. He doesn't have the same salary that myself and other year-long players have accrued to this point. So really your options are Yuki, Hulkenberg, De Vries, and Sargent. Oh boy, out of that group, maybe Yuki is the best option. Or
all right, run it back.
Dice on
Run it
Sargent.
back.
No, I'd say stick with Yuki.
Yeah,
So
run
then,
it back.
Allie, the drum roll moment of the week. Are you using a chip?
So, this is my first week playing fantasy. This is actually not even my team. This is Will's team. He's an unhappy Ferrari fan. I'm like fairly, doing all right. Aston Martin fan, feeling pretty good. What are the options for the chips? Where do I?
All right,
do I
so you're going to
actually
go
get the
back
chips?
one screen to the home for the fantasy game. So if you go up to the, or you could use apply chips there. That works too. So here are your options. You can see Will hasn't used any of them yet. We talked about the 3x DRS boost. That's going to triple one driver's score. Limitless, which allows for infinite cost cap and substitutions. The no negative chip means any driver that gets negative points on the week will be set to 0, which I don't recommend because drivers usually get above 0 points on a sprint weekend because there are 3 events. Autopilot may be a good one for you because autopilot will switch the 2x DRS boost to whoever scores the most on your team. So if you put it on Max and he has some of that chaos in the race and Checo or Alonso have the most points, it will slide your 2x boost to them. The wild card, I don't think we should use quite yet. That allows you to make unlimited transfers, and you seem happy with your team based on the free transfers that you have.
Yeah.
And then the final fix, you'll see that's locked. After qualifying tomorrow, you can make one substitution on your team. So you can make it between qualifying and the sprint events or between the sprint events and the Grand Prix. So it's a very flexible chip on this weekend.
So I have one thought. This is not my team. I got 1 week to achieve glory.
Okay.
You said you're staying away from the limitless chip right now. I think Will's kind of soft for not being on the screen. So, do I use his limitless chip and deal with the consequences later?
Let's haze Will. Let's go with the limitless.
All right, let's do it.
Caution to the wind. Let's do a whole build on limitless.
Okay. All right. I want to see your
So that screen tells you that once you put on a chip, it is final.
Oh, no, we're going back now.
So let's clear out. Let's clear out those budget drivers. Let's clear out Aston Martin. We're gonna go for the most expensive build we can find. Fire away, Allie.
Lewis, that's easy. Who do we want in this fifth? Do we go George? I mean, Leclerc is more expensive, but
this will be interesting. Do you go for George on a rebound week, or one of the Ferraris to keep Will in your heart a little bit?
Nah, screw it. We're going George. We're going George.
Fantastic. Constructor number 2. What are you going to do for that? You can do something more expensive. Go for the moon.
Yeah, might as well go for Mercedes then.
There you go. I love a good Mercedes heavy build. You've got the limitless chip. Now, we don't have my roster on screen, but for those of you that haven't seen my fantasy preview or my Twitter this week, I am using the 3x boost on Max, which moves the 2x boost over to Checo, keeping the same bottom 3 drivers of Alonso, Stroll, and Zhou Guanyu, with Red Bull and Aston Martin as my constructors. So very excited for this week. These are the biggest risks that Allie/Will and I will take all season. So Allie, I'm wishing you a ton of luck besides that Verstappen pick. Hope he wins every race.
I just confirmed it, so no going back now. Lineup is set. We'll be very interested to see how it goes down.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me this week, Allie. And for all of you out there, I'll be on FanAmp and my Twitter between now and the lineup lock deadline at 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, answering all of your lineup questions. As always, feel free to find me also on Instagram or Reddit on top of Twitter and FanAmp. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. See ya.